What happened in that courtroom left Justice Clarence Thomas completely speechless. The 42-year-old congresswoman from Texas had just delivered a response so cold, so calculated, that it wiped the smug smile right off his face. This wasn't just another boring legal hearing. This was about to become the most talked-about judicial showdown of the year. The moment Thomas let out that dismissive chuckle, thinking he had the upper hand, Jasmine Crockett was already 3 moves ahead. What she said next would not only silence the courtroom, but send shockwaves through the entire legal establishment. Before we dive into how she completely dismantled one of the most powerful justices in America, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these explosive political moments that are reshaping our country. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these 2 powerhouses really are and what was riding on this moment. Justice Clarence Thomas sits at the pinnacle of American legal power. At 75 years old, he's been on the highest court in the land for over 3 decades. Known for his conservative views and rarely asking questions during hearings, Thomas has built a reputation as someone who doesn't suffer fools gladly. His stern demeanor and judicial philosophy have made him both revered and feared in legal circles. When Thomas speaks, the entire legal world listens. But on this particular day, he was facing someone who wasn't intimidated by his reputation or his position. Jasmine Crockett represents everything Thomas's old guard establishment isn't used to dealing with. At 42, she's a former public defender turned congresswoman who fought her way up from representing clients who couldn't afford fancy lawyers to challenging the most powerful people in government. Born and raised in Missouri, then educated in Texas, Crockett knows what it's like to be underestimated. Her background as a criminal defense attorney taught her to think fast, speak clearly, and never back down from a fight, especially when justice is on the line. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just any routine congressional hearing. The future of civil rights protections, voting access, and constitutional interpretation hung in the balance. Thomas and the conservative majority had been systematically rolling back decades of progress, and Crockett was there representing millions of Americans who felt their voices were being silenced. The room was packed with legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and political reporters all watching to see if this young congresswoman could hold her own against one of the most formidable legal minds in the country. Many expected Thomas to easily dismiss her arguments with his typical judicial authority. They were about to be proven very wrong. This confrontation represented a generational clash between the old guard of conservative, judicial thinking and a new wave of diverse, fearless leaders who refused to be intimidated by tradition or titles. Crockett wasn't just arguing a legal point, she was fighting for the future of American democracy itself. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Congresswoman Crockett approached the podium. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years arguing cases in front of hostile judges. But this was different. This was the big leagues, and everyone in the room knew it. Thomas sat behind the bench, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the proceedings. His reputation for intimidating lawyers was well earned, and his cold stare had made many seasoned attorneys stumble over their words. But Crockett wasn't just any attorney. She was a battle-tested public defender who had faced down prosecutors, judges, and hostile courtrooms for years. The first challenge came when Crockett began presenting her argument about voting rights protections. She spoke with precision, citing case law and constitutional precedents that supported expanding access to the ballot box. Her voice was clear and confident as she outlined how recent decisions had disproportionately affected minority communities and working-class Americans. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he listened. Those who knew him recognized the signs. He was preparing to pounce. "Congresswoman Crockett," Thomas interrupted, his deep voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Are you suggesting that this court should ignore established precedent in favor of your progressive interpretation of the Constitution?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. This was classic Thomas, using his position and authority to make opponents feel small and unprepared. But Crockett didn't flinch. "Justice Thomas, I'm suggesting that this court should consider the real-world impact of its decisions on real people, not just legal theory that exists in ivory towers." The response was respectful but firm, and it clearly wasn't what Thomas expected. His eyebrows raised slightly, the first crack in his judicial armor. The second challenge escalated quickly. As Crockett continued her presentation, focusing on how certain interpretations of the law had created barriers to justice for ordinary Americans, Thomas began to show visible signs of impatience. He shuffled papers on his desk, whispered to the justice next to him, and occasionally shook his head in what appeared to be disapproval. "Justice Thomas," Crockett paused mid-sentence, "if you have concerns about my argument, I'd be happy to address them directly rather than through sidebar conversations." The courtroom fell dead silent. No one spoke to a justice like that. Ever. Thomas's face hardened. "Congresswoman, I think you may be overestimating your authority in this chamber." The third escalation point came when Crockett shifted to discussing judicial ethics and accountability. She carefully outlined how recent controversies